welcome back. I'm glad you came back to see if I have more to offer, and I'll try and do my best. And hope you're enjoying the conference so far. And again, it's very hard to do this virtually because I so enjoy the interaction and seeing where your level of understanding is as we start this process and what questions you have. But you know, again, the plus side is that we get so many of you on that we normally might not get. So I'm starting my timer now so I can monitor my own time. Good. Okay. So if for those of you, if you missed it this morning, my name is Pamela Kahn, and I am a registered nurse, and I work for the Orange County Department of Education as their coordinator of health and wellness. And what that means is that I work in the area of school nursing and school health services with our 27 districts in Orange County and our 500,000 kids. I do work with private schools as well, and parochial schools. They all join in. We're all trying to do the best for our kids, and I've been doing this for over 25 years. So I've seen a few things. So what we're going to talk about today are adverse childhood experiences and how they affect a child lifelong, certainly during their childhood and adolescence, but what we know about this lifelong. It's a really cool and interesting topic, and I hope you enjoy it. So the subtitle is What Happens in Childhood Doesn't Stay in Childhood, and you're going to see what we're talking about in a minute. What we're going to talk about today is we're going to focus on the different types of stress and trauma and what makes an experience traumatic. And that's important. That may seem very commonsensical to you, but it really isn't. We're going to talk about how trauma experienced during childhood affects brain development. I'm going to let you know what the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study is, if you're already familiar with that. And then the relationship between ACEs, which is the acronym for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and subsequent youth health and behaviors, and frankly, adult youth health and behaviors as well. I'm going to talk about the role of the school in working with trauma-exposed students and how to care for yourself as a school staff member or anyone who works with these types of children or adults. Okay, here's what stress isn't. If stress burned calories, I'd be a supermodel. I mean, we are all under stress, and this year will attest to that like nothing else, but I bet most of us have gone the other direction this year. So stress does not make us thinner for the most part. So that's what stress is not, much to my dismay. But let's talk about what it is. Trauma versus stress. So trauma is a sudden event that dramatically explodes into your life, and it changes the way you look at the world. It totally upsets your balance, and it is quite often life-threatening. So it's a huge dramatic event that you cannot predict happening. Stress is a reaction to less dramatic and usually commonplace events that we perceive as threatening. Even though they're commonplace, they may be threatening. A job interview, any deadlines, your financial worries, your work worries. What if you run a red light? That causes you stress. It's not necessarily life-threatening if you made it through, but it causes you stress. The difference is you typically do not feel a loss of control. You usually say you might be overwhelmed momentarily, but typically you can handle this and you know you've got the skills to do it, and it's not life-threatening. So it doesn't have quite the impact on you that stress does. So trauma and stress, we're going to talk about in two different ways. We have three levels of a stress response. We have positive stress, which causes a brief increase in our heart rate and mild elevations in stress hormone levels. So you might think of this as stress when you're at a runner, at a block, getting ready to start running. If you're an actor or actress getting ready to go on stage, I guess we only use actor now, we don't use actress anymore. If you're an actor getting ready to go on stage, and this a little bit of adrenaline usually increases your performance rate too. It narrows your field of vision. It helps you focus on what you need to do. Then we have tolerable stress, which is serious and temporary stress responses, as I talked about. If you have a job interview, if you had, ran the red light, or even if you did get a ticket for it, that's serious to you, absolutely, but it's temporary, and we can buffer it by supportive relationships. So you could call your significant other or a good friend and say, you know what I just did, or before you go off to your job interview, your good friends give you a thumbs up, you're going to do great. Those are supportive relationships that helps make that kind of serious but temporary stress tolerable. And what we're going to focus on today, though, is the most difficult kind of stress called toxic stress, and that is prolonged activation of a stress response system. So prolonged exposure to stress, and particularly important is there is the absence of protective relationships. And we're going to talk about how we can fix that. But toxic stress, you are out there on your own. There is nobody to help buffer it. There is no one to help ease your way with that. And that makes the stress become toxic. Briefly, eustress, which is also positive stress, that's a new word. You've heard the word euphoria. So this is eustress, good stress. Euphoria is a good feeling. It's stressful, but primarily positive. As I said, it's short term. It motivates and focuses us. We can cope with it, and we feel excited often by it. Even though it's stressful, it kind of ramps us up, and it improves our performance. And you can see a few examples there. Promotions, new jobs, getting married, having a baby, buying a home, moving. These are all things that are positive and moving our lives in a good direction, but nevertheless, they are stressful. Tolerable stress, or is acute trauma. Like I said, it's usually a one-time short-term thing. It can be a single incident. You can be a victim of a crime. However, that can turn into toxic stress. You can have a serious accident, an earthquake. Fortunately, we don't have tornadoes here. The way we handle tolerable stress is the treatment includes immediate support. We get help immediately. We call someone or someone steps in to help us. Removal from the scene of the trauma. This is kind of important because with our 24/7 news business right now, if you see a stressful or difficult to process image on the TV, they show it over and over and over. That does you no good, that does children no good. So if something like that is on the TV, do not keep exposing yourself to it. You know what happened, don't keep watching it, don't keep talking about it. It doesn't mean don't talk about it, but to keep reliving it does not help. We may need to use medication for immediate relief if we're very grief-stricken, anxious, if we can't sleep, and sometimes we need some supportive psychotherapy for a short time while we process what happened. Lots of words on here. I know that. I apologize, but hopefully you can read it at your leisure. Toxic stress, again, is what we're talking about today. Protracted, which means really long-term, drawn out, exposure to prolonged social and or interpersonal trauma, particularly in the context of dependence, captivity, or entrapment. So is a child dependent on somebody? Absolutely. A child is dependent upon their parents and their caregivers. The examples given here are rather extreme. If the chronic maltreatment, neglect, or abuse in a caregiving relationship, hostages, prisoners of war. I don't know how many of you remember Waco. You're probably too young to remember when that happened, but I know they had some movies recently on it. It was a religious cult down in Waco, and the ATF raided it, and there were many, many children there, and it turned into a big shootout and a lot of death and drama, and there were children there. That is going to be a toxic stress for them. Oftentimes, children who are exposed to toxic stress without treatment or without intervention grow into adults with borderline or antisocial personality disorders or dissociative disorders. We will often see a lot of behavioral difficulties. We will have extreme emotional difficulties. And these patients, as adults, if they haven't gotten treatment or intervention early in life, are very difficult to treat. They may progress at a slower rate, and they may not respond to treatment at all. Because oftentimes they have evolved these personalities to handle and cope with the way life is or what life has presented to them, so they don't understand that what they're doing is wrong. This helps them cope. They are not interested in changing, and they don't respond well to therapy and have very unique and not necessarily productive ways in our everyday life of coping with their stress and interacting with others. So just to recap, toxic stress, also sometimes called complex trauma. It's chronic. It means it's ongoing, long-term. It's not a one-time event. It can turn, a one-time event can turn into it, as I say, but most of the time we're going to talk about prolonged exposure. It often begins in early childhood and often occurs within the primary caregiving system or the social environment. So it could be, for example, take the priest business that we've been hearing about. The immediate home environment might be terrific, but if that family is very involved in the church and there has been inappropriate contact between, the church officials and a certain child, that's a social environment, and that can cause toxic stress as well. So again, I want you to remember, here's something we're talking about. What is trauma? How would we describe trauma? Again, it's situations that are emotionally painful, distressing, and overwhelm your ability to cope. And it makes you feel powerless. You don't know how to handle it. But what makes an experience traumatic? This is important for you to listen to and process. A traumatic experience is overwhelming. It's very painful. It's very frightening. You feel like your fight or flight is incapacitated. I know many of us have dreams where you're frozen in place and you can't move. Well, that's fortunately only a dream, but if that happens in real life, that's pretty traumatic for you. You either feel threatened physically or psychologically. You have a loss of control. You do not have the coping skills to handle it. And you cannot regulate your emotions. You can't talk yourself off the cliff. Like when you're nervous about other things, you could say, look, I've got this. I've done this before. I can do it. You can't do it with a traumatic experience. But what I want you to remember and take away from this is that trauma is the response to the event. It's not the event itself. And the example that I always use is I have a sister-in-law whose father was an alcoholic. And she would remember him coming home from work, and the nights that she would hear, you know, the beer pop, the beer can open, the top, popping of the top, she would know what the night was going to be like. Her father had started drinking. It was not going to be an easy night. So we were at a big family gathering once, and of course the guys were having some beers, the husbands, and that happened, and she told me this story. So for me, that doesn't faze me at all. I don't even notice that sound. But for her, that causes a reaction in her, and it brings up trauma and stress from the past. So my point on this is you cannot judge what other people find traumatic. You do not know what their experience was. You don't understand what their response has been through life and what they've had to cope with. So something that to you would seem completely ordinary and not a big deal or easily, you know, handled by your coping mechanisms may not be the same for another person. So basically just don't judge. You don't understand where they've come. And if it's traumatic for them, it's a traumatic experience. We know that trauma is prevalent in the lives of children. We're going to see some data on that. It causes physical and emotional distress and naturally affects their learning and their school performance. And children and teens all definitely experience the same emotions as adults, but they often cannot tell you what they're feeling. For example, a depressed adult, if I was in the room, I'd say, what do you see in depressed adults? And you would inevitably give me back answers such as withdrawal, being quiet, sad, you know, just laying around depressed. Exactly. What does a depressed 8-year-old look like? That child is bouncing off the walls, angry and screaming, very different affect than an adult. And that child can't tell you what they're depressed. They don't understand it. So they can't express their emotions, which adds to the difficulty of helping to process them. So what do we know about youth trauma? 38% of kids and adolescents have at least one potentially traumatic event. And we'll talk about what those are by most counts. And before they turn 4 years old, 1/4 of our kids will witness or experience a traumatic event. That's a huge percentage. 12 to 17-year-olds in a national study, 8% reported a lifetime prevalence of sexual assault. 8%, that's huge. 17% reported physical assault, and 39% had witnessed violence. In older adolescents, 14.5% of those who had experienced trauma developed PTSD in response to that trauma. And of course, we know that students that are living in poverty or homelessness and other social vulnerabilities are definitely more likely to experience stress and trauma, although it happens at all stages and ages. Here's a little slide that shows you kind of, it's very detailed what goes on in the brain, but on the left is a normal neuron. And if you have taken any kind of neurobiology class, you know you have neurons, and then you have axons and dendrites, are the little branches coming off the neuron. Axons carry impulses away from the neuron, and dendrites pick impulses and bring them back. And that's how cells communicate with each other. And on the left, you see that there's a little nucleus in there, a little round area, purple it looks like, and you have all these branches coming off, and those are axons and dendrites. And then you have a slice there. It says typical neuron with many connections, and it kind of looks like tree branches coming off. On the right, you have an image of a neuron from someone who has undergone chronic stress. Look at the difference between the two. Look at how few connections there are in the chronic stress neuron than there are in the typical, or what we call normal neuron. And the same thing with the slide. You do not see as many branches coming off. So what the result is that the brain cannot communicate with each other. In a child that has a wonderful childhood, nurturing, loving parents, great social connections, great support, we're going to see on the left, that's what their brain would look like if we could look at it, and things would be shooting along and messages would be going appropriately, the appropriate levels of neurotransmitters would be going through and, giving you the good feelings, the bad feelings, the warning feelings, all of that. The brain on the right cannot do that. It simply does not have the real estate to do it. So we have to adjust our expectations of children who have undergone chronic stress and as to their behavior, their emotional capacity compared to a child with normal stress levels. Again, we talked about poverty. Oftentimes, and this is a generalization and it is not true certainly of every family who lives in poverty, but oftentimes violence, excessive noise, poverty, homes that live in poverty are often quite noisy. They can be chaotic. They live in areas where there are more pollution. They may suffer from malnutrition, and that doesn't necessarily mean not enough food. It can mean not the right food. Abuse and parents without jobs, which is a stress. It certainly can affect the interactions, formation, and pruning of connections in the young brain. We reach a point in our development where we have all those axons and dendrites being developed, and then there's a couple times in your life it happens. They get cut back. Your brain sort of recognizes, I don't need quite this many, let's cut a few back. Inappropriate pruning, there is a suspicion that inappropriate pruning at around the ages of 20 or so lead to schizophrenia. So inappropriate pruning, we don't want to see that happen either. So we want pruning of connections, the lessening of them to be, and leave enough to work with. Here's a chart that shows, we know that children who live in poverty decrease in their brain the gray matter, which is our cerebral cortex where we think. And here's a chart that shows this. And you can see from the ages, it starts at the age of 5 months and goes all the way up to 3 years. So at 5 months, there's probably not a significant statistical difference between the volume in cubic centimeters of the gray matter. But as you move to the right, by the time you see 3 years old, there is quite a big difference between the green, which is high socioeconomic status, and the purple, which is low socioeconomic status. There is actually a physical difference in the development of brain cortex, which again creates a real estate issue. They do not have the same capacity for critical thinking, et cetera, that a brain that has developed normally has. And this is interesting. From 2018, the Public Policy Institute of California has stated that 46% of the kids in our state, California, were poor or near poor. So that's almost half of the kids in our state live in a state of poverty. And 4.7% of those live in deep poverty. And we have to remember that in California, the federal government has declared a poverty level, and that's sort of, generalized throughout the whole United States. I'm going to tell you that what is a poverty level in Mississippi is not the same as what is a poverty level in California, and you all know that. A family can make a significant more amount of money than the federal poverty level and still be living in poverty in a state like California. This is a great slide. I mean, it's sad, but it's really illustrative. This is a PET scan, and the brain on the left is what we call a normal brain that we don't think has undergone excessive stress, et cetera, no problems. And you can see in PET scans in the red areas light up when there's a lot of activity. That's oxygen being taken up, and when we exercise, our lungs need oxygen, and when we think a lot, our brains need oxygen, and that's what the red areas indicate. The top is your front part of your brain up here in your front, and the temporal lobes are on the side, and then down at the bottom is your back brain, which controls your breathing, heart rate, all those things that you do not need to think about. So that's a normal brain. The brain on the right is a PET scan of the brain of a Romanian orphan who was institutionalized shortly after birth. I don't know how many of you remember old Life magazines articles or have seen this, but children in those Eastern European and sometimes Asian country and Russian orphanages were taken in, they were fed, they were changed, and left in their cribs. They were not nurtured, they were not loved, they were not soothed when they cried, etc. So this is what we have left. How much red do you see on the right-hand brain compared to the left? Boy, there is not much happening up in the temporal lobe. There is not much happening in the cerebral cortex up there. Down in the back, the red part is the same as, or even this one looks a little more, because of course the heart rate is going, the person is breathing, all of those impulses and functions are happening. But not much else. And look at the difference in the structure of the brain. Look how many dark areas. So again, abused brains physically are different than healthy brains. And here's the areas of the brains that are particularly affected. The prefrontal cortex, which is right up in the front of our foreheads. That's our long-range planning, delaying our rewards, understanding all that, thoughts, emotions, and actions. And that matures later in childhood. If those of you who are in the room, I would ask you, and the correct answer is really about 26 or so when that completely formalizes. So if you have 18-year-old sons at home, they're driving you crazy, keep the faith. They're not done yet. They're still baking. The little tiny dark blue thing is the amygdala, and that is embedded deep in our brain, and that is regulates to a great extent our emotional responses, and we know if something is threatening or not. So the story I told you about my sister-in-law, she hears that beer can popping, her amygdala lights up and says, this is scary. Mine does not. But that's the difference, and that's what will happen when you are chronically exposed to certain stresses. And that matures early in the life, so that stage is set. The hippocampus is kind of the thing that I always describe, looks like a shrimp there, and that's where your short-term memory is, and it connects, again, the emotion to the fear. Is this an appropriate response? You know, because sometimes, you know, say people are afraid of getting in elevators. Your brain, if you have a healthy brain, says, hey, I know this is not rational. If you don't have a healthy brain and you have a brain that's grown up under trauma, you may not even be able to regulate and make that association that I'm just scared. I'm scared. I don't care. This is scary to me. You may not be able to talk yourself down. And that also matures early in the years of life. So those two inner structures are mature earlier, and the prefrontal cortex matures later in life, which is helpful. And we'll talk about why. Trauma's impact on brain development. These are all the areas. And again, when you look at the slides later, you can really take a look at what the results are of a trauma's impact. They're going to have trouble with attachment, their physical health, and we'll talk about that. Unable to regulate emotions, disassociation, removing themselves from difficult situations psychologically. Cognitive abilities are difficult. Remember, the short-term memory is in the hippocampus, not going to be able to process information or retain it. Self-concept, when they don't do well, when they're struggling, they can't learn, they can't function socially, of course, their self-concept suffers. And we're going to see behavioral control and difficulties with that because they haven't learned patterns. Their brains aren't wired to, they haven't learned healthy patterns. Their brains aren't wired to get the proper impulses, the proper neurochemicals, etc. Here's kind of a nice illustration. So a typical development, a baby's born and they have to learn to survive. They know they have to eat, you know, they cry when they're hungry, they cry when they're cold, etc. Well, then eventually, if they're well tended, they learn to regulate themselves. They learn that they don't need to cry all the time. Their needs are going to be attended to, et cetera. So they can simmer down a little bit there. Then that allows them real estate to grow socially and emotionally. They can start putting processes into that because they don't have to put so much energy into surviving or soothing themselves. They've learned those skills. Now their social emotional growth, how to relate to kids, how to play. When that all is going well, then the last thing to start developing is your cognition. And that can all go on a pyramid like that. And of course, we hope that the survival takes the least amount of time and energy and the cognition will take the most in a child that is experiencing normal development. If you are under trauma, look how much time has to be spent on survival. If your needs are not met, you are not taken care of, that's where all your concentration's going. And it leaves you less and less skills or ability to move up that scale and develop your cognition. And many of you will be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where you see kind of the same thing. You have to start off with your basic needs, safety, food, shelter, etc. And then as you move up to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you develop more, I think the top one is self-realization. You can eventually learn who you are, what you are, feel comfortable with yourself, etc. So this is a similar thing that happens with a trauma and brain development. So when a child is traumatized, the trauma will cause the brain to adapt in ways that contribute to their survival. And these adaptations can look like behavior problems in normal contexts, such as school, social settings, etc. So an example is, say there's a kid at home, say it was my sister-in-law, and this wasn't her, but I'm using her as an example. But say that when dad comes home and he's been drinking, he tends to beat or abuse in whatever way whoever's inside. The child in that house will learn to make themselves as invisible as possible because that's how they survive. So when they come to school, they're going to sit in the class and they're going to be quiet. They're going to be withdrawn. They are not going to make eye contact. They're certainly never going to speak up. We, as teachers or friends or whatever, say, what's wrong with that kid? That's weird. Look at him. But we don't understand that that's a behavior that has helped them survive. It looks abnormal to us, but it is not abnormal to them. When triggered, when they get afraid, when they're traumatized, their feeling brain will dominate their thinking brain, and they react, like I say, emotionally. They'll shut down, they won't deal with people, or whatever their survival mechanisms are, those engage. And when they do, the normal developmental process is interrupted. Remember, if you're all traumatized and you have stress hormones going through your body, et cetera, you cannot create the normal relationships, you cannot use normal behaviors, and your normal development is interrupted. So students may internalize behaviors, meaning depression, anxiety, or they may externalize and be bouncing off the walls and aggressive and bully. Fight, flight, and freeze. What do these look like in children? These are normal expressions to trauma. We all have them, or fear. Fight, you're going to see hyperactive verbal aggression, oppositional behavior, etc. Flight will be withdrawal, escaping, running away, self-isolation. They don't come to school, they don't come to class. Or freeze, that's what I was discussing earlier. They're still, they watch, they look dazed, they just shut down, they don't engage. So these are things you're going to see. They're very different reactions, but they're all responses to possible trauma. So if kids are overloaded with stress hormones, they can't focus on their schoolwork, they fall behind in school, they can't develop healthy relationships because they have poor self-images, they don't trust adults. When they feel badly about themselves, they're not fitting in, they're not succeeding, they find solace in food, alcohol, tobacco, as we all find solace somewhere when we're stressed, right? Drugs, inappropriate sex, high-risk sports, and or work. Some of us are workaholics, and that's a bit of a mechanism we use to avoid stress. But remember, the difficulty here with these people is they don't regard these coping methods as problems. They see them as a way to obtain relief and to escape from depression, anxiety, anger, fear, and shame. So, you know, if they drink, we've all probably seen this happen. We think, oh my God, they had too much to drink. Why didn't they, watch themselves? But the person drinking is like, man, this makes me feel better. I can forget about my problems. I'm not socially stressed. I'm not afraid to talk to anyone. So that's a coping mechanism for them. They don't see it necessarily as a problem what other people do. So the ACEs study, let's talk a little bit about what the ACEs study was. It's a partnership between Kaiser Permanente and the Centers for Disease Control. It began a long time ago. They followed the initial study subject for 15 years. However, this study has been replicated over and over. They looked at about 17,000 adult participants, and they had a retrospective approach, meaning they looked back in their life, asked them questions what had happened in their life. The questionnaire asked for detailed information on the past history of abuse in their life, neglect, family dysfunction, as well as what their current behaviors and health status are. This key concept, what I remember, we're going to talk about the study, is what they found is that stressful or traumatic childhood experiences result in social, emotional, and or cognitive impairments. What we've talked about, a fear-based childhood will disrupt the neurodevelopment and can actually alter the normal brain structure and function. So the study looked at 3 general types of ACEs, abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. And within each of those categories, they broke it down into 10 different ACEs. Abuse can be physical, emotional, or sexual. Neglect can be physical or emotional. And household dysfunction included questions related to mental illness in the family, an incarcerated relative, a mom treated violently, anyone with substance abuse, and look at the last one, divorce. Divorce is considered an adverse childhood event. I think half of our families have been through divorces. The ACE score is the total number of adverse childhood events that each participant reported. For example, if a parent had physically neglected a child, that child gets 1. If that child also witnessed the mom being beaten, that has a score of 2, etc. The higher the score, the higher the risk for later health problems, the ACEs study showed. And given an exposure to one category, there's about an 80% chance that a kid has been exposed to another. So what happens when you have adverse childhood events? It increases your health risks. Your behavior changes, right? You don't exercise when you're depressed or anxious. You may take up smoking to relieve your stress, drinking, taking drugs. If you're hungover or depressed, you're missing work. When you start doing things like this, what happens to your physical and your mental health? If you don't exercise, you're going to have weight issues, which may result in diabetes and depression. You may have higher suicide attempts if you're not feeling good about your life. If you're sexually promiscuous, which is another form of coping, you may have an higher increase of STDs, heart disease because of obesity, drinking, smoking, cancer, stroke, etc. Broken bones, if you're drunk, you can fall down and break your arm. So you see how when you have adverse childhood events and your behaviors change, subsequently your physical and your mental health will change, and this carries on through life. This, you can look it up online anywhere. Just look at ACEs questionnaire, and here are all the questions. Did a household member go to prison? Was a biological parent ever lost to you through divorce, abandonment, or another reason? Do you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or who used street drugs, etc.? These are the questions on them. And this was taken prior to your 18th birthday, so these were in their childhood developmental years. Here's a summary of how the ACEs study pyramid goes. It's another pyramid. So at the very bottom, when you're born, say you have adverse childhood experiences. You were neglected, you weren't fed, you're abused, etc. You are going to suffer from disrupted neurodevelopment. We talked all about that. Less axons, less dendrites, less transmission, less neurotransmitters, less brain capacity. When you have that, you're going to suffer subsequent social, emotional, and or cognitive impairments because your brain doesn't work like everyone else's. When you feel badly about yourself or you can't cope with things, you're quite likely to adopt high-risk health behaviors, smoking, drinking, etc. When you do that, you're more than likely to develop disease, disability, and social problems, which inevitably could lead to an early death. So it's a straight-up pyramid with adverse childhood experiences. More than half of adolescents, this was from a national study of child health, have at least one adverse childhood experience, and nearly 1 in 10 have experienced 4 or more. So, 1 in 10, if you're in a class of 30 kids, that means 3 of those kids have had 4 or more, and 15 of those have had at least 1. So this is a substantial number of children in our society who are experiencing adverse childhood events. Here is one, and this is 2011 to 12, and I know things have changed since then, but I haven't found such a nice graphic since then. Here are what the most common adverse childhood experiences are. Economic hardship is one, the largest one, followed by divorce, death of a parent, et cetera, et cetera. The one I want you to take a look at is the far right, being treated or judged unfairly due to race or ethnicity. This was in 2011 and 2012. I guarantee you, with all the changes we have had in our society over the last few years, it would be more than 4.1 who feel they're being treated or judged unfairly. So these are some examples of what you would likely see and how many people are affected. We know that Black and Hispanic children in almost all regions of the United States are more likely to experience adverse childhood effects. Here's an interesting statistic. Watch this. So if you have 0 ACEs, 60% of our non-Hispanic white kids say, I'm great, nothing, I've had a great childhood. 49% of Hispanic kids will say same thing. 39% that we're dropping down of our non-Hispanic Blacks. This is the interesting statistic. More than 75% of our Asian non-Hispanic kids say, nope, I'm perfectly fine. And I kind of wonder, because we all know there are cultural differences, and there are some cultures, and the Asian culture is one of them, who do not want to talk about mental illness, who do not talk about, they have a quieter approach to family troubles and stresses. So, that may be legitimate. It's pretty kind of an outlier, so I suspect there's a bit of cultural influence going on there. But bottom line is we do see more ACEs in Black and Hispanic children. And here's the one that we usually see in white kids. The most common one is living an adult with mental illness. In Black non-Hispanic children, they experience most likely parental incarceration or a death of a parent. And Hispanic children experience most often living with an adult who has a substance abuse problem and parental incarceration. ACEs are more prevalent in children in low-income families. and this is kind of interesting, it's sort of transverse, but I think that's kind of coincidence. 60% of kids with family incomes under 200%, and we talked about the federal poverty level, have at least one ACE, but only 26% of kids in families much higher than the poverty level have one or more ACEs. So we do see it more in a lower socioeconomic families. So the higher the ACE score, the more we see risky health behaviors in childhood and adolescence, including more pregnancies. We see more suicide attempts, early initiation of smoking, sexual activity, and illicit drug use. Kids who have ACEs engage in more risky behaviors because they are soothing themselves and trying to fit in and unable to handle their stressors appropriately. This chart just kind of details what we talked about: adverse childhood experiences, the neurobiological impacts and health risks, followed by the long-term health and social problems. Here's what will commonly trigger traumatized kids. If you're working with them, be aware of these: unpredictability or sudden change. It's best to tell kids, in 5 minutes, we're going to do this, and then after that, we're going to do this. Transitions are difficult when they have a loss of control, when they feel they have no say in the matter, when they feel vulnerable or rejected. I used to sit on a SARB team, and kids would come in who hadn't been to school for SARB, a school attendance review board for kids who aren't coming to school, and kids would often come in, and I heard this many times. They would say, well, I went in, and the teacher would say, oh, glad to see you today. Don't do that. They feel vulnerable, they feel rejected, they feel laughed at, they leave, they just shut down. If you confront them with authority or limit setting, they're not going to respond well to that. If they feel lonely, or if they have a sensory overload, too much chaos, too much noise, those will trigger reactions in kids with trauma. You might see all these kinds of things with kids who have suffered from trauma when they're triggered, and there's a whole list of them. So what do we do now? It seems hopeless. It seems these kids do not have the brain capacity. There is a difference. So I often get the question, so what, are these kids doomed forever? No, absolutely not. There is always hope. We need to talk about protective factors, resilience, and developmental assets. When we can create safe, stable, nurturing relationships, we can lessen and prevent the consequences of childhood adversity. Remember, even earlier in the plenary section, we talked about communities working together to create a safety net for kids. If the family can't do it, the school can maybe do it, a counselor can maybe do it, a Boys and Girls Club can do it. We need to have safe, stable, and nurturing relationships. And ACEs can be long-lasting, but they don't have to be. We need to have the tools and utilize tools to help children thrive in the faces of their adversity and move forward, so they're not they end up in jail for the rest of their life or dead on the streets, etc. So what are protective factors? They're attributes of individuals, families, or communities that mitigate, meaning lessen risk, and promote healthy development and well-being. And some examples would be creating social emotional competence of children. And I talked about that earlier today. Schools are very interested in creating more and more programs around creating social and emotional competence. As I say, boundaries, self-confidence, recognizing your own feelings, verbalizing how you feel, conflict resolution, etc. Concrete support in times of need. Remember that when you have a one-time traumatic event, that if you get support, it kind of soothes that and calms it down. So we need concrete support in times of need, whether that's in the form of a family, a teacher, a pastor, etc. Supportive social connections. This is why we encourage social activity in kids, have them join clubs, have them play with each other in positive manners in the community. And we need to teach parents knowledge of parenting and child development. I know I have a 3-year-old granddaughter I just spent 18 days with, and I'd forgotten what a 3-year-old is like. And at least I remembered and knew enough to how to handle. But you have a first time, particularly young parent confronted with a 2 or 3-year-old. Wow. So if they know that's normal, if they know that's part of a normal healthy development, don't take it personally. It's much more helpful. So we need to make sure our parents understand parent and child development. And again, we have parent and family communities in Department of Education where we hold meetings and we do provide education as to this topic. So let's talk about resilience. Resilience is the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, etc. One of the biggest determinants of being resilient is having a nurturing and supportive relationship with adults. It can be one adult, hopefully it's way more than one, but even one adult will help a child to develop resilience. And that helps lessen the stress mechanisms in the brain. It promotes better, we have good neurotransmitters and bad neurotransmitters. I mean, they're neither good nor bad, but some create more positive feelings and some create more stressful feelings. That's my meaning. So when you build resilience, if there's a supportive adult, positive neurotransmitters come out that create a different sort of environment in the brain than the negative ones will. So here are some tips. I'm going fast, I know, but I have a lot of material, so forgive me. You can look at the slides after. But here are 10 tips for building resilience in kids and teens. Make connections, which is exactly what I've been talking about. Help your child by having him or her help others. Nothing makes us feel better than when we are in service to others in whatever form it is. Merely helping a child read a book, a sibling read a book, have that child clear the table and compliment them, etc. Maintain daily routines. Kids thrive on routines. They love it. They'll object and they don't want to do it, but they thrive on routines. Take a break. Teach your child how to focus on something besides what's worrying him. We have a lot of kids who are very concerned about the virus now. We hear it all over. Parents are wearing masks. Parents are concerned. Take a break from that. Say, let's talk about something else today. We're healthy today. We don't need to worry about that today. Teach your child self-care. There is nothing better to make us feel important and in control of ourselves than when we can care for ourselves. Teach your children or students how to do things for themselves. Make their own phone calls when they need something. Do their own laundry. Know how to fix your own meal, etc. How to navigate the city if they have to get on buses, etc. Move towards your goals. Set reasonable goals. Reasonable goals. Don't say to your child or a student, you need all A's on your next report card or else. Say, you know what? Let's try and get 2 of your grades up out of 7, maybe. Set reasonable, achievable goals. If it's too hard, we all get defeated. Nurture a positive self-view. That doesn't mean everybody gets a trophy, but it just means concentrate on what you did well and tell them what they did well. Kids know when you're not genuine. So don't tell them something that's not true. Find something that's true and reinforce that. Look for opportunities for, I can't read that because I have my, there we go. Look for opportunities for self-discovery. When kids are struggling, it's often the times we learn the most. I remember I had a friend who took a test and she said, I can do 100 right answers, but the 2 wrong ones I learned the most from. And that's what we need to teach our kids. When things are tough, that's when we figure out, well, how did you figure that out? And good for you for figuring that out. And you made it, and you did it, and you accomplished it. And accept that change is part of living. Don't get worked up. I mean, I always say it's a good day when nothing goes wrong. Normal days, things go wrong. And that's just life. So do not over-dramatize it. Just say, yep, that's what happens in life, and how are we going to make it better? There's something called the 40 Developmental Assets, and they have them for various ages, and it's by the Search Institute. And there are 40 positive supports and strengths that young people need in order to succeed in life. There are external and internal assets. External assets, they focus on the relationships and opportunities in families, schools, and communities. So they're supportive relationships that we mentioned earlier. Internal assets are the social, emotional strengths, values, and commitments. So what's inside you? What motivates you? What soothes you? What comforts you? What are you good at? What values do you hold, etc. And these have been around for quite a while, and they've done studies, and it shows that the more assets that young people have, less likely they are to engage in high-risk behaviors, and they will do better. Less smoking, less substance abuse, less early onset sexual activity and pregnancies, on and on. Youth with the most assets are least likely to engage in all of the behaviors that I told you about. And youth with the most assets are more likely to do well in school, be civically engaged, and value diversity, which is critically important these days with our country and our world changing so much. And we are one global nation now, really. We're not, French or German or American, we are global, and diversity is something that is here to stay, and we need to learn to value it and honor it. Here is 40 developmental assets. This is basically what I described to you. It has 40 different things that children need, and they're external and internal, which I described. External are supports, empowerment, boundaries and expectations, and constructive use of time. And internal assets are their commitment to learning, positive values, social competence, and a feeling good about themselves. And you can find these online. You just go to Search Institute and find the 40 developmental assets. It's important to remember that while some kids can cope with transitions or traumatic experiences with just supportive family and through their own strengths, some will need additional services and support. So make sure you keep eyes out if it's your family member or a student you work with or a child in your life. Sometimes they're going to need extra help. I'm going to talk briefly about secondary traumatic stress because this is pretty important for those of us who care for people, whether you're in the healthcare industry, the educational industry, you work in preschools, whatever, or caring for a family member. We all have to watch out for secondary traumatic stress. It's for people who care for or hear about or witness suffering of others. I had a friend in nursing school who there was a student in her district, and it was La Habra, and this child had been kidnapped by a person in the community, murdered, and put in a cement block. And this nurse, this had happened a few years before, and she was still, when she would describe it, she would cry about it. I mean, and it's worth crying about, but I mean, she had a little bit, obviously, of PTSD. This affected her so deeply. And again, the professions that are at high risk are our healers, physicians, our attorneys, nurses, psychs, social workers, hospice workers, child protective service workers, certainly. And families who care for relatives who are ill or suffering are also vulnerable to secondary traumatic stress. So take a look if you're in one of these categories, listen up. It's important to recognize early before it really takes the stuffing out of you that you're having a bit of difficulty. You may have compassion fatigue, which is really what I said. You're just, exhausted by what you've seen or heard or are dealing with. You may feel isolated, anxious. You may not feel well physically. You may not be sleeping well. You may feel burned out. You might not want to talk about your work or not get the joy that you used to get from it. And you may be even more susceptible to secondary traumatic stress if you have personal exposure to a traumatic event. If you're a rape counselor and you were raped, you need to make sure that that's not interfering with how you're handling it internally. Or if your sister was a rape victim, that might still be hard for you. It might bring it home. So if you have experienced it or know someone who has experienced the same trauma, you may react differently. If you have direct contact with children's traumatic stories, if you were there when this happened and you understand, you may not be able to support that child in the way you should. Or if you are so busy taking care of everyone else that you are not taking care of yourself, you're going to wear out. So we're going to talk about self-care because that's very important. And moms, listen up. You can't neglect yourself. Remember, what is it? What is it saying about mom and dad? Daddy's happy when mom's happy, or a happy home is when a mom's happy, something like that. You got to take care of yourself. Here's some signs to watch for if you're going to, if you want to be aware of if you're starting to suffer from secondary traumatic stress. You feel numb or detached, low energy or fatigue, and these are a little long-term. This isn't a day or so. This is going on for a week or two. If you engage in self-destructive coping mechanisms, drinking too much, smoking too much, etc., you're not doing well at your job and you know it. You're just not motivated. You're not up to par with what your production level is, etc. If you're confused, you can't concentrate, you can't make decisions, you're just overwhelmed. Or if you keep reliving events in your mind. If your spiritual strength is diminishing, you question your meaning of life, or you don't even know what you're here for. And if you're not relating with your family, those are signs that you might want to watch for and realize, hey, something's not right. And again, if they go on for a period of a couple weeks, that's when we need to pay attention. So how do you handle that if that's happening? Remember, when you're flying, you put your own oxygen mask on first, which to any parent seems like, ugh, I want to take care of my kid. But guess what? What if you're trying to take care of that child and you go down? Who's going to take care of that child? So take care of yourself first. Guard against isolation. Work in teams and talk with others. Talk with professional colleagues who know, or if you're done with the shop talk, talk to friends or family about what you're experiencing. Address your own traumas. Make sure you've processed things appropriately and that your support strategies are working for you. If it goes on longer than 2 to 3 weeks, do get some help, get some counseling. There's no shame in it. It doesn't have to be a lifelong thing. We can use it for rough spots. It happens. Secondary traumatic stress happens. So I have this little cartoon here. It says, I like how Bonnie's not stepping on my last nerve. Figure out who won't ruffle your feathers. Spend time with those who are not experiencing trauma. If you're a counselor or a child service worker, hang out with people who don't have those difficult things in life going on. It'll do you good to get out in the light for a little bit. Eat well. Live to eat. Don't eat to live. It pays off if you eat well. Your energy level is higher. You just feel better. You sleep better. Exercise, whatever you can stick with. If it's walking, great. Yoga and meditation are fabulous because they help you learn to calm. If that's not your gig and you like to get a hop on your bike and ride for an hour, great. Stick with whatever will work for you, but move. You know, studies have shown that even minor activity, regular minor activity, is as effective in battling depression as a low-dose antidepressant. So get out and move. Take a break during the workday, even if it's only a short walk, or go have lunch by yourself and read a book. Take a break. And it's okay to cry. If you have to cry sometimes, that's okay. But also make sure you find things to laugh about. Here are some resources that I've got here that will help support some of the information that I've given you today. I've got a couple pages of those. Secondary traumatic stress, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, Adolescent Work Group, the Harvard Center on the Developing Brain, lots of really cool information to read about that. And then OCDE, if you're interested in what student mental health resources we have, and I put some resources in my earlier presentation as well, you can find them there. And here's what I want to tell you. I always like to end with this. If you think you are too small to make a difference, try sleeping with a mosquito. So you all make a difference in what you do. And thank you every day for what you do. You do make a difference in someone's life. You may never know it, but you do it. So thank you again. And if there's any questions?
Yes, thank you so much, Pam, for that wonderful presentation. If you guys have any questions, feel free to add that to the chat real quick and I can read it off for Pam. I have one quick question. Can you speak to the difference? You're talking about the neurological impact of trauma. Can you speak at all to the difference of what that looks like for somebody who has continuous trauma in childhood versus somebody who maybe has one isolated acute traumatic event, and how those different scenarios impact the brain?
Right. So, you know, brain development takes place over a while, obviously. I mean, the amygdala and the hippocampus don't develop overnight. It's a process. So when those things are developing and the axon and dendrites are developing, if it's a one-time hit, it's not going to have much effect on brain development, particularly if there's support and all of that, you know, given to the child. In fact, it may have no difference. If it's a 2, 3, 4-year thing when this child is young and developing and those chronic stress hormones are being put out, the brain is simply not going to develop. So, you know, there definitely is the more time spent in an abusive situation, the more damage that is done to a brain. And even a couple hits early on in life, as long as there is support there and the kid moves ahead. I mean, there are some kids who live in difficult situations. They lose people, people die, people put in jail, they get divorces. Kids can be okay as long as the family rallies around and supports them. So poverty is not necessarily a guarantee that they're going to have problems. Having a parent incarcerated, none of these are guarantees. They all can be alleviated and prevent the damage by supportive relationships and by doing our resilience strategies as well that I listed, what we can do to help kids.
Perfect, thank you. It's a great answer. We have somebody asking if you can go back to the presentation slide that has all the resources on it. And then if I can get, if you want, if it's okay with you, if I can get these slides from you, I can also post them for people to come back to.
Oh yeah, please do post them. Here are some of the resources. Yeah, I think it would be best if Claire would post them post this because, you know, then you can look at your leisure for it. There is also a great website if you're interested in ACEs, and I really breeze through it because you can talk I can, for an hour or two on ACEs easily, just that alone. It's called ACEs Aware. And, you know, really, it makes a lot of sense because you've seen people who grow up in difficult situations and they don't function as well as we do. They engage in illegal activities, they have destructive relationships, and you're kind of like, what's going on there? Well, it's because their brain is different, wired differently. And again, it's like I said this morning, we need to look at people and say, boy, what happened to you? Instead of what's the matter with you? We have not walked in their shoes. We don't understand their experiences. And so we don't understand their coping mechanisms. So look at ACEs Aware. There's lots of information out there on that. In fact, California has its first Surgeon General now, and she is a huge proponent of ACEs. She is one of them that, one of the physicians that really spearheaded the effort in California. And now for Medi-Cal providers, they all have to ask these questions of their children, of their young patients, to determine the level of ACEs in their lives and then how to provide intervention. So that's, you know, just fabulous. We're happy about that.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for being here. We so appreciate you and all of your expertise between the plenary and the workshop this afternoon. Both have been super informative. And for all of our attendees, just so you know, both of those presentations are recorded and we'll be posting them here on Whova. So you're not getting rid of Whova after this weekend because you're going to be able to come back and watch all of the sessions for 6 months after this. So we hope that you can come back, see slides, see any parts that you missed. So thank you all so much for being here, and we're going to transition to at 3 o'clock. We have our final plenary for today with Dr. Sandy Morgan and Bella Hunake and Kim Yim. So we will see you guys all over there in just a couple of minutes. Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Have a good weekend.